Star Wars Battlefront 2 has been out for just over a week at this point for those of us without an Origin Access membership, and during that time it's managed to inspire the most downvoted post in Reddit history, one of the largest controversies to hit the modern gaming industry, and likely, ultimately, will be responsible for numerous new anti-gambling related legislations for games to curb in-game currency and earn-game gambling, as well as of course microtransactions. With those achievements in mind then, is Star Wars Battlefront 2 even a game worth playing? Hello and welcome, my name is Disaster, this is Star Wars Battlefront 2, and in today's video I wanted to give you my experience playing Star Wars Battlefront 2. In essence, we're going to be talking about the game as it is now at this point in time. We're not really going to be focusing too much on the controversies around this game, although we will be mentioning them briefly to begin this video. Most importantly, however, we're going to be talking about what this game has to offer, giving it a full review, talking about things like the progression systems, the loot boxes, of course, the general experiences, gameplay and gunplay, infantry versus vehicle, the whole lot, balance, and of course team play. Now before we get into taking this game apart, what really makes it work and what doesn't, let's cover what everybody essentially already knows about Star Wars Battlefront 2, and that was, or it still is, that there was at one point a pay-to-win aspect in this game. The battle boxes, loot boxes, whatever you want to call them, that were purchasable for real money are tied to the progression system. Now there's no way to excuse this behavior. This is not a free-to-play game. These scummy free-to-play tactics that are found in kind of usually mobile games are only really excusable in those games, and certainly not excusable for those of us playing AAA shooters, which we are literally paying a full game $60 price for. No way to get around this, no way of defending this. However, the loot box system as per se shouldn't be thrown under the bus because of this game. And this is an important point I would like to make. Progression systems tied to loot boxes and randomness, let alone pay to win, absolute no-go. However, not important, not game-changing, something that does not actually impact combat items, things like skins or different character models, which are simply nice to have, being available in loot boxes which can be purchased for real money, is actually something that, if implemented correctly, is both in the interest of the company selling the game, the publisher and developer, and of course the player playing the game. If you look at games like Overwatch, games like CSGO, what these loot boxes or respective systems have allowed them to do is to continue to develop the game, continue to introduce new content for the game without requiring some form of DLC or premium pass model, meaning that the community as a whole continuously receives new content, making the game simply nicer to play, and it means it lasts longer, and also removing the possibility of splitting the community base between, for example, premium and non-premium content, as for example seen in some of the past Battlefield games such as Battlefield 4 or Battlefield 1. Doesn't tend to work out in favor of the gaming community whatsoever, which is why something like a loot box system where it is not tied to progression or in-game advantages is actually something that is beneficial to not only the publisher and producer, but also to those of us wanting to play those games for a longer period of time. Leaving the disgusting and dirty business practices then to one side, given that they now, at least temporarily, have been removed, let's talk about what remains after that. There is, after all, an entire game here to talk about, and the first thing we should talk about is likely the simplest, and that is the big picture here. This game sounds amazing, this game looks amazing, the atmosphere is fantastic, and it shows that games are increasingly getting to the point where they are creating truly believable universes, where somebody who did watch the Star Wars film and does enjoy the Star Wars universe ultimately, instantly feels at home. It's an amazing game to be playing from those perspectives. You really do feel like you're in one of the respective Star Wars worlds on one of the respective planets, attacking or defending one of the respective battles being fought. Absolutely fantastic job on DICE's art team in that sense, and also on their technical team, because the game runs very well considering how good it does look. And this is coming from somebody who plays Battlefield 1, which likely most people would agree was the best looking and sounding shooter up until the launch of Star Wars Battlefront 2. DICE does this again and again. They produce the best looking, best sounding shooter every time they publish one. At least it's been that way for the last few years, in my opinion. But leaving the very big picture aside, let's go a little bit smaller. Let's talk about some mechanics. Specifically, actually, let's talk about the progression mechanics, which of course are tied into the loot box system. We're not going to be talking about the pay to win aspect. We've already covered that. Putting that to one side, because it currently isn't possible to pay yourself through progression, how did the progression system, well, do when it comes to reviewing it? It's pretty obviously pretty poor. And the reason for this is quite simply that it's based on luck. You can play the game, and the more you play the game, the more battle packs you will have available to you. That's a simple matter of math, essentially. Player time equals credits equals loot boxes. However, that doesn't mean that it's a good progression system, because it doesn't take into account what you play, how you play, or whether you play well. The third point there being the most important, for me at least initially. If you do a great job in playing a game in any given mode, you get almost as many credits as the worst player in your team, assuming he's played the map, for the same period of time. That's really a shame, because when you're playing a game, you want to be rewarded for when you do well. That's just part of shooters. That's part of a good progression system. That's no secret. And DICE seems to have missed the mark here, with there being close to no difference with the number of credits you actually earn when you do well or don't do well in any given game. Furthermore, we can tie this into the individual classes as well. Class progression is not only based on star cards that you get out of loot boxes and upgrade. Said star cards, or at certain levels, require certain class level requirements. Now, instead of making class levels mean, for example, that you've played that class a lot, you've gotten a certain amount of kills or a certain amount of points with that class, the levels are actually tied to the number and grade of star cards that you have. So if you have 3 level 1 star cards for the assault class, you're going to be a level 3 assault. If you have a level 2 and a level 1 star card for the specialist, the scout class, then you're going to be level 3 specialist. You can literally be any level with any class without actually having ever played them. It's that stupid. So you could spawn in the first time with your heavy being class 10 without ever having played heavy, because you've up until that point only ever played the assault class, for example. Which means that, well, if you're trying to unlock something specific for any given of the classes when it comes to star cards, well, there's no way of doing it other than just praying that you get that individual star card, or you get general star cards that you can upgrade that star card because you now have the level requirement. In my opinion, that's silly, that's stupid, that makes zero sense, and the only way you can basically understand why this was done is if you start looking and talking about, again, the pay-to-win aspects, because that makes perfect sense if you take that into account, because that would mean that people get frustrated with trying to progress towards whatever they want, so they decide to go and buy a bunch of crates so that they can hopefully get what they want. Whether or not they actually get the necessary card or get enough cards to then upgrade the cards that they wanted to upgrade is another matter entirely. So progression system out of the way, and progression system is not one where I can really compliment Star Wars Battlefront 2 at all, I'm afraid. Let's talk about the next aspect of Star Wars Battlefront 2 that isn't going to get any praise, and that's the team play aspect. Now, I am aware Star Wars Battlefront 2 is a casual game and not a game orientated much towards team play. That's fine. That's what you have games like Battlefield or Rainbow Six Siege for it, or Overwatch. Plenty of games focus on team play. Star Wars Battlefront 2 doesn't. That is fine. The only problem arises is where this game tries to actively seemingly make it difficult for me as player to enjoy a multiplayer shooter experience with my friends. The party system is broken and buggy and doesn't really work. And more importantly, even if I am in a party with one of my friends, we're in the same server, there's no way for us to coordinate our actions other than physically finding ourselves on the battlefield. I cannot spawn on him. I get shown where he is at any given time, but we're not even guaranteed to come in the same squad if we spawn in at the same time. Only if there's not enough people essentially spawning at that period of time, so everybody's put in one squad. That's the only way you can actually spawn in together. It's silly. Why can I not play with my friends? Why are you making it so difficult to play with my friends? And further on to this, I would criticize is the amount of team play that you really can have in this game. I would wish a little bit more. The only team play class, the only class that can really benefit the players which are surrounding it is the officer, who has, of course, the ability to give essentially a temporary health boost to the surrounding players, as well as put down things like shields or turrets, which of course will support and help surrounding teammates. Other than that, disappointing when it comes to the team play aspect. Equally disappointing is the balance aspects of Star Wars Battlefront 2, but why am I even surprised about that, given that the last shooter that DICE produced, Battlefield 1 equally suffers from absolutely atrocious team balancing and map balancing for individual modes, objectives, etc. Star Wars Battlefront 2 is worse in that sense. I'm not sure they even have a team balancer in Star Wars Battlefront 2 at this point. I'm actually quite convinced they don't, because it seems that half of the games are just absolute pushovers. And that seems to be happening to me both on the winning and losing team. In half the games, it seems to be the case that one team is from minute one noticeably just going to easily win the entire thing without there ever being even a chance of the other team winning, because they just have the better set of players. Of course, the fashion in which you acquire elites and heroes only compounds this and makes it worse, but nevertheless, I would have hoped for a much better team balancer, and I would have hoped for some better map design when it comes to balance for Star Wars Battlefront 2. Map design in general in Star Wars Battlefront 2 isn't that bad, on the basis that, unlike, for example, Battlefield 1, everything isn't just a long range or everything isn't just close quarters. It's somewhat appropriate to, well, what most of the classes can perform at. There's long ranges for those playing specialists, there's close quarters for those playing the assault class, and you can usually choose your engagement distance because there's enough cover to move up on an objective or to move away from an objective. But when it comes to individual modes and game modes, there seems to have been very little attention paid to whether or not a certain way in which the design is made favors any given team at any given point. That out of the way, however, let's move on to the biggest segment of today's video, and that's going to be combat. Specifically, of course, hero combat, air combat, elites, and of course the 4 main infantry classes. And here there's both praise and criticism to be garnered for Star Wars Battlefront 2. Let's start with likely the biggest group of threats that you're ever going to face on any given game in Star Wars Battlefront 2, and that is the heroes. They do have the potential to swing a game, and they certainly have the potential to properly ruin your day. And they do. They're extremely powerful. Nevertheless, I'd say over time now, I don't feel they're, well, of course they're overpowered. They're supposed to be overpowered, but not too overpowered. They're not too crazy. I especially like the system where you take a certain amount of damage, your overall health, which you will regenerate to, decreases. So that if you're too risky, if you play the class wrong, and if you get caught out, which ultimately you will, over time you're going to become weaker, or less tankier rather than as hero. So eventually you will die. However, it's not down to a certain time limit, it's down to how effective you essentially play your hero, which is a great way of combining skill with a generally skillless and quite overpowered hero. Speaking actually of skillless, however, the heroes aren't as bad as you maybe would have thought or even remember from Star Wars Battlefront 1. If you don't know what you're doing, a lot of these heroes are just not going to help you. You can die without getting a single kill with these heroes if you rush in stupidly or if you get caught out or flanked. It's not that you cannot do well. They can be very powerful, but you need to know at least on a basic level. And therefore I can here only commend DICE for, I think, doing quite a good job when it comes to heroes. There's still minor problems with it. For example, I think that the lightsaber heroes are simply the better group of heroes compared to for anybody wielding anything but a lightsaber, because they'll stun lock essentially everybody they hit with their lightsaber, meaning that if you get close enough to a lightsaber hero with something like Han Solo, something like Leia, somebody like Iden Versio, you're dead. No matter how much health you are, no matter how good you are, you're just dead. There's nothing you can actually do to avoid getting killed by them, because they're just going to lock you in place as soon as they land the first lightsaber hit on you. Moving away from heroes to aircraft, something I haven't tested quite as extensively as I have the heroes. Nevertheless, as newbie pilot, I like to say it's not actually that bad done. The flying is a lot better than it was in the first Star Wars Battlefront. However, especially on PC, I think somebody designed it for the consoles and didn't port it properly to PC. Let me explain why. Essentially, all of your controlling seems to be done, other than pitch and roll, over your mouse on PC, which is untypical for flying in PC. Usually we have at least the opportunity to bind pitch up or pitch down to something like space and shift, for example. Now, while you can bind those pitch up and pitch down, it's look up and look down if you're looking for it in the controls on PC to space and shift. What it actually does is, once you hit them, for example, the pitch up button that you've assigned, it will pitch up continuously without you holding the button until you press the pitch down button, and it won't just stop pitching up then, it'll just endlessly pitch in that direction. So really, it's not possible to actually control the fighters that way. You do have to do everything over the mouse, which I personally don't necessarily like too much. That aside then, let's move on to the elites, and this is where we start getting into a little bit more of a critical aspect of the class design that they've got. You've got things here like gunships, rocket troopers, battle droids, a true infinite number of them seemingly, and that's cool, but a lot of them seem to be really overpowered to a certain extent. Now, I know they're supposed to be elite classes, they're supposed to be powerful, but there's a difference between a powerful class that can be killed, like a hero for example, and then something that's just eventually going to die, but before it gets taken out is just ridiculously OP. For example, something like the gunship, where you have this essentially green laser gun you shoot down and almost one bang any infantry. That's just stupid. No infantry class really has much to do against that. I know there's certain special star cards that you can equip to better fight aircraft and of course the gunship as well, but in reality, unless you've got a fighter that actively goes for it, which usually they're too busy doing other things, shooting other pilots to actually do, then that guy's just going to go on a 10-12 kill streak without any difficulty, without even knowing what he's doing. For my part, I speak of personal experience here. The first time I got into that vehicle, I instantly managed to kill 10 or 12 people without knowing what I was doing and without actually having even studied or looked at what the special abilities, the star cards that were equipped for that vehicle were. That's silly. Then again, other of the elite classes, other of these special classes seem to be fine when it comes to balance. The only thing I would wish for is that there weren't quite as many of them at the same time on any given battlefield, on any given map. And that actually applies for the heroes as well. You get these scenarios where you just have 2 or 3 heroes and like a bunch of super battle droids and maybe even a tank just all at once rolling up on you, and you just go, well, I'm just gonna suicide. There's no point. There's nothing you can actually do. They need to be spread out a little bit more. There needs to be less of them on the battlefield, in my opinion, to avoid them being so ridiculously OP. Because once you start stacking them up on one team, things get quite nasty for the other team, who maybe isn't doing so well and as a consequence doesn't have as many of them available to them. However, with these special classes and the heroes now out of the way, let's talk about what I think is the most important part of any shooter game, and that's the infantry combat, the base class combat, which of course in this game is the assault class, the officer class, the support class, or rather the heavy class I should say, and the specialist class. You may want to call it the scout class if so will. Now here, there's positive and negative to be said. First of all, assault class, specialist class. Well done, DICE. Generally, the weapons are sensible, they have enough power, they're not too weak, time to kills don't seem to be too bad, at least with the better versions of the weapons. Why, for example, most of the starting weapons for every class are pretty shit, pretty bad, I don't know, but once you unlock some of the better weapons, things are quite good. Star cards seem to take over a little bit and be even better than primary weapons by quite a long shot. And I think that's a shame because when I'm using the assault class with something like a CR2 close quarter weapon, I don't feel it's necessarily right that I'm being beat out by something like a Vanguard or something like an infiltrator specialist ability. Really, you know, abilities should always be secondary to your primary weapon. However, that's not something that Star Wars Battlefront has ever really followed, and as such, I guess you just have to accept it. While the specialist class and assault class are not bad, the officer class is a little bit disappointing. It doesn't seem powerful enough to really keep up. Yes, he can be extremely powerful in the team play sense, but he doesn't really seem to have anything to enable him to keep up with any of the other classes at any other given range. He's not bad. He just seems to be slightly worse than every other class. But the real class that I think needs to be readdressed is the heavy class. That class, but for its abilities, is absolutely useless. The weapons, at least the first 2, I haven't managed to unlock any of the others because I cannot stand playing it, are extremely bad, it seems. I mean, the time to kill, accuracy, any given range just seems to be awful. The abilities of the heavy class, for example, the shield, of course, the sentry mode, they're quite good. They're very good, but it's just not enough, in my opinion, to make that class worth playing. And I would argue, as I had before, that the primary weapon should be the strongest bit about any kind of infantry class. And as such, if you want to make something enjoyable to play, give it a decent weapon to use. Ignore all the star cards to start off with, balance those accordingly later. First give somebody a decent weapon, which at least at its given range, its ideal range, is going to do well, which the heavy, at least in my experience, just doesn't seem to have. Now, with all that being said, Star Wars Battlefront 2 isn't necessarily a bad game. It seems to be, to a certain extent, a flawed game, a game that could use some major improvements, but as long as they keep the pay-to-win far, far away from this game, it's not a game that is unplayable, if you so will. It needs improving, but it is playable. That's at least my opinion. Most of its points, most of the positivity from this game will simply come from the fact that A, it looks gorgeous, B, it sounds gorgeous, and C, sadly, it's Star Wars. And Star Wars simply has that appeal, whether or not you agree with it or not. But what do you think about Star Wars Battlefront 2? And would you like me to put out more content on that game? Be that live commentaries, be that guides, tips and tricks videos. Leave those opinions as well as your video suggestions down below in the comments or hit me up with them on Twitter. But with all that being said, I'd like to thank you very much for watching and hope to see you in the next Battlefront 2 video.